A Tale of Two Cities. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. Paris. A very long time ago in Paris, a doctor called Alexandre Manette was released from prison. He had been locked up for 18 years. He was in prison not because he had done something wrong, but because he had stood up for what was right. In doing the right thing, Dr. Manette made enemies. Powerful enemies who threw him into prison. In those days, the rich and powerful ruled France. Ordinary people were kept poor and hungry. But anger and despair were bubbling beneath the surface. In a few years there would be a violent revolution. It would bring about the deaths of the King and Queen of France and many of the rich and powerful. Our story starts a few years before the revolution, just after Dr. Alexandre Manette was freed from prison. He had moved into a room above a tavern in a poor area of Paris. The owners of the tavern, Monsieur and Madame Defarge, were friends of his. Dr. Manette's mind was scarred by his experience in prison. The one good thing that had happened there was that he had taught himself how to make shoes. Now he clung to his workbench and tools as if they were the only things in the whole world that he could trust. One day, the door to his gloomy attic room opened. There stood Monsieur Defarge, a beautiful young woman and an older man. "You have visitors," said Monsieur Defarge. Dr. Manette did not look up from his workbench. "Here is a gentleman who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one," said Monsieur Defarge. "Show him the shoe you are working on." Manette, the older man, whose name was Jarvis Lorry, took the shoe in his hand. "Tell him what kind of shoe it is, and the maker's name," said Defarge. "It is a lady's shoe," said Dr. Manette softly, still not looking up. "And the maker's name?" 105, North Tower, said Dr. Manette. Mr. Lorry realized Dr. Manette was saying his old prison cell number instead of his name. 105, North Tower, the Dr. Manette repeated. "Do you recognize me, Dr. Manette?" said the young woman. Dr. Manette kept looking at his work. The woman moved towards him. Although her face was young and Dr. Manette's was old, anyone looking at them side by side would have thought that they looked alike. The shoemaker caught sight of the hem of her dress as she neared him. He looked up and stared at her. "Are you the jailer's daughter?" he asked vaguely. The young woman's name was Lucy. Her golden hair tumbled down her neck. The shoemaker reached up, took a curl in his hand and peered at it. Lucy laid her hand on his shoulder. Monsieur Defarge and Jarvis Lorry watched from the doorway. They hardly dared to breathe. The shoemaker took off a blackened string that hung round his neck. A scrap of folded rag was attached to it. He opened the rag carefully, on his knee. Inside were two long threads of golden hair. Dr. Manette reached for the woman's golden curls again. His eyes moved from them to the strands in his hand. "They're the same." "How can it be?" he asked in wonder. "She laid her head upon my shoulder that night when I was taken away. When I was brought to the North Tower, I found these few hairs upon my sleeve. I have kept them ever since to remind me." The shoemaker was too tearful to continue. Lucy wrapped her arms around him. "We have come to take you away from here," she said. Her voice was on the edge of tears, too. "We are going to England, to London." Lucy was Dr. Manette's daughter. He had last seen her when she was a little golden-haired child. Lucy's mother, who was English, had died soon after her husband's imprisonment. Then Lucy's guardian, Jarvis Lorry, had taken her to live in England. Lucy had not seen her father again until that very moment, in the attic room in Paris. Soon after, the three of them, father, daughter, and guardian, boarded the carriage that would take them out of Paris. They were waved off by Monsieur and Madame Defarge. When the travelers reached Calais on the French coast, they got on a boat to Dover. Dr. Manette took pity on Dr. Manette. Lucy was very grateful to him. He was kind to them and helped find them the most sheltered spot on the small ship. Lucy and her father were happy in London, and, day by day, he began to get better. Lucy sometimes thought of Charles Darnay, though she did not expect to see him again. London. The criminal court in London was known as the Old Bailey. It was full of people. They had come to watch the trial of a spy. Eager faces strained around pillars and corners for a glimpse of the person standing in the dock. He was a young and handsome man, about 25 years old. His name was Charles Darnay. It was the Frenchman who, 4 years ago, had been kind to Dr. Manette and Lucy on the boat. The trouble was that Charles Darnay was French. Britain and France were not at war, but the two countries were very suspicious of each other. And Darnay seemed to have been behaving oddly. Against their will, Dr. Manette and Lucy were called as witnesses against Charles Darnay. The lawyer, who was trying to prove Darnay was a French spy, asked his first question. "Miss Manette, have you seen the prisoner before?" "Yes, sir," said Lucy. "Where?" "On board the boat that brought my father and me to England. Aula did talk with the prisoner on you that journey across the channel?" "Yes, sir, tell us about it." Looking fondly at Charles Darnay standing in the dock, Lucy said, "When the gentleman came on board the boat." "The gentleman?" said the lawyer. "Do you mean the prisoner?" "Yes, sir." "Then say prisoner. When the prisoner came on board, he noticed that my father was very weak. The prisoner was kind and gentle to us." "Never mind all that," said the lawyer. "Did the prisoner tell you that he was traveling under a false name?" "He told me that he was traveling on secret business that might get people into trouble. That is why he did not use his real name." Seeing how bad her words made Darnay look, Lucy began to weep. "Monsieur Darnay is a good man, I am sure," she pleaded. "Never mind all that," replied the lawyer. The last thing the lawyer wanted was for Lucy's words to convince the jury that Charles Darnay was innocent. Then something odd happened. Another witness was called. He said that he had seen Darnay hanging around near a dockyard. He believed that the Frenchman could have been spying on the soldiers and sailors who worked there. The lawyer defending Darnay was called Mr. Stryver. Sitting next to him was an untidy man, who lounged casually on the bench. This man nudged Mr. Stryver and whispered in his ear. Mr. Stryver asked the witness, "Are you quite sure it was the prisoner you saw near the dockyard?" "Quite sure," said the witness. "Have you ever seen anybody who looks like the prisoner?" "I don't think so," said the witness. "Look carefully at this gentleman here," said Mr. Stryver, pointing to the man lounging next to him. "And now look carefully at the prisoner again. They look very like each other, don't they?" It was true, they did look very alike. Especially when the untidy man, whose name was Sidney Carton, took off his wig. Everyone in the courtroom gasped and nodded in agreement. People started to talk among themselves. Those two men might almost be twins. "They're doubles. That witness can't be trusted. And the nice young lady thinks the prisoner is innocent." "Quiet," the judge bellowed. The courtroom fell silent once more. The jury went away to consider its verdict. Was Charles Darnay guilty or not guilty of spying for France? After several anxious hours, the verdict came back, not guilty. Afterwards, Charles Darnay thanked Sidney Carton, the man who looked so much like him. "It was nothing," said Carton carelessly. "I don't know why I did it, anyway." Sidney Carton was altogether a careless young man. He was a friend of the lawyer, Mr. Stryver, and sometimes helped him in